Hi, this is Lucy Dixon, and this is my podcast on Antonio de Velasco, and the title is I'm a Southerner Too, Confederate Monuments and Black Southern Counterpublics in Memphis, Tennessee. I decided to focus on this article primarily because of the title. It really caught my attention. I'm a Southerner too. I really realized right away that it was about how a lot of Southern heritage is based off of white history, and a lot of people who support the Confederacy will say, like, well, it's my heritage. And this completely ignores that Black people have also lived in the South for as long as white people, and they have just as much history and heritage in the South. The article starts out talking about the monument of Forrest, who started the KKK in Memphis, Tennessee, and there was a movement called #TakeHimDown901, which was a Black-led coalition. They had to jump through a lot of hoops and state laws that claim that you can't take down any historical monument that's on public property. So they actually, the government had to sell it to a nonprofit in order for them to be able to take it down. That was a really inspiring piece of action that happened, and the fact that they actually got it done was very cool. One quote that I really liked on page 236 was, Brundage, for instance, identifies the broad historical contours of the commonplace use of Southern, which implies that Southern heritage is the exclusive property of whites. The phrase property of whites acquires a kind of literality when one takes into consideration the hundreds of monuments to the Confederacy sprinkled across the South. Up until now, I never really realized how synonymous the phrase like Southern or Southern heritage is to white history or to white culture and to Confederate culture, but I always get angry when people say, oh, it's my heritage, because you can't say that without recognizing that it is a Confederate term. It almost seems like a dog whistle for neo-Confederates. Another quote I liked on page 237 was, my nieces should be able to run through the park free, not in the shadow of men who would have sold them into slavery and to brothels. Black Southerners do have to constantly live under the shadow of all this memory and all of the honoring of these Confederate figures who would have sold them into slavery and into brothels, and that's just something that white people never have to experience, and it's an extreme example of inequity in the South. Black Southern heritage has such a strong impact on the South and its culture and all of its music and its art and just so many things about the South, and this isn't a good thing, but so many of the buildings were built by slaves, and yet for white people it's so easy to look around them and forget that Black people had such an important impact on our culture and just everything around us. Southern heritage should be something for everyone in the South, not just for people whose ancestors owned slaves. I'm from Charleston, and Black culture has a huge impact on my city. All the markets downtown are a lot of Black art and crafts and stuff, and tourists love to buy that kind of stuff, but the impact of the Black community always seems to be kind of like understated to tourists, and it's not as big of a deal as like white Southern culture or heritage in my city, which is very unfortunate. Because even though the markets that are primarily run by Black Americans, the Southern plantations are even more popular. Like there's a plantation right now near my house called McLeod Plantation, and people go to see the gardens and like the beautiful house and the fields, and there's an option to go see the slave houses, but it's completely removed from all the attractions, and I think that it's a little bit of a removal of that very important part of the history of that plantation. There was an interesting quote on page 238 that says, today, whites and Blacks in the region are equally likely to identify as Southerners. This was not true just 2 decades ago. While it's good that Black people are more comfortable identifying as Southern now, it just is terrible that it took so long for this community to even say that in a place that they've lived for maybe hundreds of years. On page 239, a quote that backs up what I just said is, you say this is about Southerners' rights. Well, I'm a Southerner too. My family were all slaves in the Fayette County. We have the bills. We own the land. We have the land my great-great-grandparents were slaves on. Most of the people in Memphis were slaves in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. So saying the Confederacy in Southern heritage and depicting Southern heritage as being blonde-haired and blue-eyed doesn't represent all Southerners. At one point, there were more Black people in the South than white people. She used that as a very compelling argument in her fight to take down the Forrest statue in Memphis, and it worked. In conclusion, the phrase Southern heritage wrongly erases centuries of Black history in the South, and the removal of Confederate statues helps the Black community to feel more at home in the South.